Jake Morrison wiped his grease-stained hands on an equally stained rag and squinted at the diagnostic readout floating above his workbench. The holographic display flickered between red warnings and amber cautions like a Christmas tree designed by someone with severe anxiety issues. He took a sip of his coffee, if the brown liquid in his mug could still legally be called coffee after 6 hours on the heating plate, and grimaced. "Another day in paradise," he muttered to the empty workshop, watching through the reinforced viewport as another damaged ship limped toward Haven's Rest. The orbital station hung in the void like a metallic tumor, all mismatched modules and improvised connections that somehow managed to keep 30,000 souls breathing recycled air and drinking recycled everything else. The comm system crackled to life with station control's perpetually harried voice. "Morrison, you've got an incoming, Base 7, and Jake, this one's fancy." Jake raised an eyebrow at his reflection in the darkened monitor screen. Fancy usually meant one of two things on Haven's Rest: either some corporate executive's yacht with more chrome than sense, or a diplomatic vessel whose pilot thought gold plating would somehow make their engine problems disappear. Both types tended to tip well, though, so he wasn't complaining. He made his way through the station's corridors, nodding to the usual cast of characters. Maintenance Chief Rodriguez arguing with a recalcitrant atmospheric processor, Mrs. Chen from the noodle stand chasing down a customer who tried to pay with counterfeit credits, and a group of Terran Marines on shore leave who were already 3 drinks past sensible. The station operated on what Jake liked to call organized chaos theory. Everything looked like it was about to fall apart, but somehow never quite did. Base 7's blast doors were already cycling open when he arrived, and Jake had to admit that station control hadn't been exaggerating about the fancy part. The ship sliding into the docking cradle was a work of art, all flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to shift color in the artificial lighting. It was also thoroughly wrecked. Scorch marks ran along its hull like battle scars, and several sections were held together by what appeared to be emergency repair foam that glowed a rather alarming shade of purple. "Well," Jake said to himself, pulling up the bay's diagnostic systems on his portable scanner, "someone had a very bad day." The ship's engines powered down with a musical hum that definitely wasn't standard Terran technology. Neither was the soft chime that announced the opening of what Jake assumed was an airlock, though it looked more like the ship was simply deciding to become temporarily permeable in one specific location. The woman who emerged moved with a fluid grace that made Jake wonder if Haven's Rest's artificial gravity was malfunctioning again. She wore a hooded cloak that managed to look both practical and elegant, a trick Jake hadn't known was possible, and when she turned toward him, he caught a glimpse of features that would have made a Renaissance sculptor weep with envy. "Are you the engineer?" she asked, her voice carrying an accent Jake couldn't place. It had musical qualities that suggested either expensive vocal coaching or non-human vocal cords. Given the ship she'd arrived in, Jake was betting on the latter. "That depends," Jake replied, activating his diagnostic scanner and watching it immediately start having what could only be described as an electronic nervous breakdown. "Are you looking for someone to fix that beautiful disaster you just flew in here? Or are you looking for someone to validate your life choices? Because I'm only qualified for one of those things." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, barely visible beneath the hood. "The former, I hope." "Good choice. Life choice validation is expensive, and I'm not licensed for it in this sector." Jake gestured toward her ship, which was now settling into the docking cradle with a series of mechanical sighs that sounded distinctly relieved. "So, what happened? And please don't tell me you tried to outrun a customs patrol. I get 3 of those a week, and the excuses are getting repetitive." "Pirates," she said simply. The classics never go out of style." Jake walked around the ship's visible exterior, his scanner beeping frantically as it tried to make sense of the technology it was encountering. "Though I have to say, if these were ordinary pirates, They were either very good or very lucky. This kind of damage usually comes from military-grade pulse weapons. The woman's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a tension that spoke of secrets and complications. Jake had been fixing ships in the neutral zone long enough to recognize the look of someone whose story had more chapters than they were sharing. "The repairs," she said, clearly changing the subject. "How long do you estimate?" Jake's scanner finally gave up trying to identify the ship systems and defaulted to its universal alien technology detected warning. He switched it off and relied on his eyes instead, noting the elegant integration of systems that seemed to blend organic curves with crystalline structures. "Well, that depends on whether you want it fixed or you want it fixed right," he said, circling back to face her. "I can slap some patches on the obvious holes and get you flying again in maybe 6 hours. But looking at this beauty, I'm guessing you'd prefer the fixed right option, which means understanding what I'm working with first." "How long for the second option?" 2, maybe 3 days. "And I'll be honest with you," Jake gestured at the ship's exotic hull plating. "I've never worked on anything quite like this before. I'll figure it out, but it might involve some creative interpretation of your manufacturer's specs." For the first time since emerging from her ship, the woman laughed. It was a sound like silver bells being played by someone with an excellent sense of humor. Creative interpretation might be exactly what it needs. Music to my ears. Fair warning, though. My creative interpretations tend to involve a lot of cursing, several pots of coffee, and at least one moment where I question every life decision that led me to this point. If that's going to bother you, now's the time to find a different engineer. I think I can endure some colorful language in service of a good repair." Jake grinned and extended a grease-stained hand. "Jake Morrison, Chief Engineer, Senior Technician, and sole proprietor of Morrison's Mechanical Miracles. We fix everything from coffee makers to capital ships, and we only charge extra for the miracles." She hesitated for just a moment before reaching out to shake his hand. Her grip was firm and warm, and Jake noticed that her fingers were longer and more elegant than most humans. "Lyra," she said simply. "Well, Lyra, welcome to Haven's Rest, where the coffee's terrible, the air recycling sounds like a dying bantha, and the repair work is surprisingly good despite all evidence to the contrary." As if summoned by his words, the station's atmospheric system chose that moment to emit a particularly dramatic wheeze from somewhere overhead. Lyra looked up at the sound, then back at Jake with raised eyebrows. "That's just Henderson," Jake explained. "He's the atmospheric processor for Section C, been threatening to retire for about 15 years now, but he keeps showing up for work. We've learned to interpret his moods by the quality of his wheezing." "And what mood is he in now?" "Philosophical melancholy with hints of impending breakdown. Pretty much his default setting." Jake pulled out his work tablet and started making notes. "So, Lyra, before I start taking your ship apart to see what makes it tick, I should probably ask, any systems I should be especially careful with? Weapons, navigation, life support, experimental reality warping drives, that sort of thing." Again that almost smile. "No reality warping drives, I'm afraid." "Shame. Those are always fun to work on, right up until they accidentally fold you into 11 dimensions, and you spend the rest of eternity as a geometric impossibility." Jake had seen his share of alien technology over the years, but Lyra's ship was making his brain hurt in entirely new ways. He stood inside what she called the primary systems compartment, though it looked more like the inside of a crystal geode that had been crossed with a particularly artistic computer server room. Conduits of light pulsed through translucent walls, and what appeared to be the main computer core hummed a complex harmony that his universal translator kept trying to convert into Terran show tunes. "So," Jake said, waving his scanner at a crystalline structure that was definitely not in any engineering manual he'd ever read, "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but your quantum flux regulator is singing opera, and I'm pretty sure that's not supposed to happen." Lyra, who had removed her hood to work more comfortably, revealing ears that came to elegant points, paused in her examination of a nearby control panel. It's expressing concern about the harmonic resonance in the propulsion matrix. Your computer sings when it's worried. All Etherian systems use musical interfaces. It's more intuitive than your linear readouts. Jake blinked. Your entire ship communicates through music. Not just music. Harmonic frequencies that convey complex information states. What you're hearing as opera is actually a detailed diagnostic report about 17 different system anomalies, 3 maintenance recommendations, and a request for better quality lubricant in the dorsal stabilizer assembly. Of course it is. Jake made a note on his tablet. Ship thinks in songs, probably judges my singing voice. And I'm guessing you don't have any spare Etherian lubricant lying around Haven's Rest. Unlikely. Right. Well, the good news is that synthetic lubricants are basically the same across most species. It's one of those universal engineering constants, like how everyone's emergency rations taste like disappointment. Jake pulled out his portable analyzer and connected it to what he hoped was a diagnostic port. The bad news is that half these systems are running on technology I've only seen in theoretical papers, and the other half appear to be operating on principles that violate several fundamental laws of physics. Lyra moved to stand beside him, close enough that he caught a faint scent of something like cinnamon and starlight. Which laws specifically? Oh, minor ones. Conservation of energy, causality, the speed of light being an absolute limit. Nothing important. Jake's analyzer beeped cheerfully and displayed a readout that looked like someone had translated a physics textbook through 6 different languages and then fed it to a computer with a head injury. Your propulsion system appears to be folding space-time like origami. The metaphor is more accurate than you might think. Terrific. I love working on ships that bend reality for a living. It's great for my blood pressure. Jake studied the readout more carefully, trying to make sense of the numbers. Okay, I think I see the problem. Your fold space generator is running about 30% over optimal efficiency, which is causing cascade failures in the quantum flux network, which is making your AI cranky, which is probably why it's singing Puccini instead of whatever passes for elevator music in your culture. How did you determine that? Jake pointed to a section of the readout where several curves intersected in what looked like a very unhappy graph. See this pattern here. In human ships, when your power distribution starts looking like a pretzel, it usually means something upstream is working too hard. The mathematics are different, but the principle is the same. Push any system beyond its design limits long enough, and everything downstream starts complaining. Lyra studied the display with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. You diagnosed a quantum flux cascade failure by comparing it to human power distribution problems. Hey, energy is energy, whether it's flowing through copper wires or crystalline matrices that sing about their feelings. The universe has patterns, and most of them repeat at every scale. Jake disconnected his analyzer and moved to examine what appeared to be the ship's main power coupling. Though I have to admit, this is the first time I've had to calibrate a repair based on musical theory. You're not what I expected from a human engineer. What did you expect? Someone who hits things with hammers until they work. Something like that. Jake laughed. Oh, don't worry, I'll definitely be hitting things with hammers before this is over, but first I try the sophisticated approach. He pulled out a small device that looked like a tuning fork crossed with a multimeter. I borrowed this from the station's music teacher. If your systems really do communicate through harmonics, maybe I can figure out what they're trying to tell me. He activated the device near the quantum flux regulator, and immediately the ship's humming shifted into something that sounded distinctly more optimistic. Several displays around the compartment flickered to life, showing complex wave patterns that pulsed in time with the music. Well, that's interesting, Jake muttered, watching the patterns. Your ship likes my tuning fork. It's responding to the harmonic resonance. You're speaking its language. I'm a polyglot now. Human, basic, sarcasm, and apparently Etherian computer. Jake moved the tuning fork closer to different systems, watching how the musical patterns changed. You know, this is actually kind of elegant. Instead of error codes, you get whole symphonies that tell you exactly what's wrong and how to fix it. Most engineers require years of training to interpret the musical interfaces properly. Yeah, well, most engineers didn't spend their teenage years trying to tune a motorcycle engine by ear, because they couldn't afford proper diagnostic equipment. Jake grinned as he made another connection between the harmonic patterns and the ship system states. Turns out mechanical sympathy translates pretty well across species. I think it likes me, Jake said, patting the nearest wall panel affectionately. What do you call your AI anyway? Lyra hesitated. The formal designation translates roughly to Harmonious Guide of the Celestial Path. That's a mouthful. Mind if I call it Harmony? I suppose that would be acceptable. Great, Harmony meet Jake. Jake meet Harmony. Now that we're all friends, how about you show me where you keep the spare parts? The AI responded with a complex melody that somehow managed to convey both amusement and mild exasperation. I'm going to take that as a yes. As Lyra led him deeper into the ship, Jake couldn't help but notice how she moved through the corridors with practiced ease, her hands automatically adjusting controls and checking displays without conscious thought. Either she was remarkably familiar with this particular vessel, or Etherian ships were more intuitive than their musical interfaces suggested. So, he said, stepping carefully around what appeared to be a crystalline tree growing directly from the deck plating. Pirates, huh? Must have been some pretty sophisticated ones to do this kind of damage to technology this advanced. Lyra's step faltered slightly. They were unusually well equipped. Mem. And I suppose they also happen to have weapons specifically designed to disrupt Etherian quantum flux systems. You seem to know a great deal about Etherian technology for someone who's never worked on it before. Jake shrugged. I read a lot of technical journals. Amazing what you can learn when you're stuck on a space station with limited entertainment options. He paused beside what looked like a maintenance panel, though it was singing softly to itself in a minor key. Plus, I've got a theory that all advanced civilizations eventually develop the same basic solutions to engineering problems. The implementation might be different, but the underlying principles are universal. And what principle explains pirates with quantum disruptors? The principle that when someone tells me they were attacked by pirates, but their ship was damaged by military-grade weapons, either the pirates have gotten a lot more organized, or there's more to the story than I'm hearing. Jake looked at her directly. But hey, everyone's got their secrets. I just fix the ships. I don't judge the circumstances that broke them. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead and stepped back to admire his handiwork. The quantum flux regulator was now humming a cheerful tune that his translator had given up trying to convert, settling instead for displaying the message, Happy Machine NOISES, in blinking text. He'd managed to integrate 3 different types of human-manufactured components into the Etherian systems, creating what he privately called the galaxy's most expensive hybrid engine. Well, Harmony, he said to the ship's AI, I think we've officially violated about 12 different engineering standards and possibly a few laws of physics, but you're running better than when you arrived. The AI responded with what sounded distinctly like laughter, causing several nearby panels to flash in synchronized patterns that reminded Jake of applause. I'll take that as approval, he said, making final adjustments to the power coupling he jury-rigged from salvaged Terran military components and what appeared to be crystallized moonbeams. Though I have to warn you, my modifications come with a 30-day warranty and a stern warning not to exceed 90% of rated capacity, unless you want to find out what happens when quantum mechanics get into an argument with human stubbornness. Lyra emerged from the ship's depths carrying 2 steaming cups of something that smelled considerably better than station coffee. "The food synthesizer finally accepted your modifications to the power grid," she said, offering him one of the cups. Jake accepted it gratefully and took a cautious sip. The liquid was warm, complex, and tasted like someone had distilled the concept of contentment into beverage form. "This is amazing. What is it?" "A traditional Etherian blend. The closest translation would be comfort of distant stars." "Of course it would be. You people don't just make coffee, you make liquid poetry." Jake took another sip and felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying melt from his shoulders. "I'm adding this to my list of reasons why humanity needs better diplomatic relations with your people." "What else is on that list?" "Well, there's your musical computer interfaces, your ability to fold space like laundry, and the fact that your ships are powered by what appears to be crystallized good intentions." Jake gestured around the engine compartment, where human components now interfaced seamlessly with Etherian technology through connections that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a degree in both engineering and interpretive dance. "Plus, you've got the most polite AI I've ever worked with. Most human ship computers would have electrocuted me by now for the modifications I've made." As if responding to the compliment, Harmony chimed a pleased melody and displayed a holographic thumbs-up symbol that it had presumably learned from Jake's tablet. "You've taught it human gestures," Lyra observed with what might have been amusement. "Hey, cross-cultural communication is important. Besides, Harmony's got a sense of humor. Watch this." Jake turned to address the AI directly. "Harmony, what do you think of my engineering skills?" The response was immediate. A complex musical phrase that Jake's translator rendered as competent barbarian with good intentions. "See, diplomatic but honest. I respect that in a computer." Lyra's laugh was interrupted by the sharp whine of the station's proximity alarms. Jake frowned and pulled up the local traffic display on his tablet, watching as several new contacts appeared at the edge of sensor range. "That's odd," he muttered, studying the tactical readout. "Those ship signatures don't match any of the regular traffic patterns, and they're coming in fast." The station's communication system crackled to life with the harried voice of traffic control. "All docked vessels, we have unidentified ships approaching on an intercept course. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Jake looked at Lyra, who had gone very still beside him. "Let me guess," he said. "Those wouldn't happen to be more of those unusually well-equipped pirates you mentioned, would they?" "It's possible." "Right. Well, the good news is that your ship is now running at about 115% of original efficiency, thanks to my creative interpretation of your design specifications. The bad news is that we're currently docked to a civilian station with the defensive capabilities of a particularly aggressive soup kitchen." The proximity alarms shifted to a more urgent tone, and Jake's tablet began displaying incoming missile signatures. He counted 6 ships, all moving in formation with the kind of precision that suggested military training rather than opportunistic piracy. "Okay," Jake said, setting down his cup of liquid poetry and moving toward the ship's control panels. "New plan. How fast can you get this thing undocked and maneuvering?" "The repairs aren't complete. Several secondary systems are still." "Lyra, those ships out there are carrying enough firepower to turn Haven's Rest into a very expensive cloud of debris, and I'm pretty sure they're not here for the noodle stand. Sometimes you have to choose between perfect repairs and continued existence." Lyra moved to the pilot station with fluid grace, her hands dancing across controls that responded to her touch with musical acknowledgments. "Harmony, begin undocking procedures. Emergency departure authorization." The AI's response was an urgent staccato rhythm that Jake interpreted as the computer equivalent of "hold onto something." The ship disengaged from the docking clamps with a series of mechanical thunks that sounded considerably less musical than the rest of the Etherian technology. Through the viewport, Jake watched Haven's Rest fall away as Lyra maneuvered them clear of the station's superstructure. "So," Jake said, gripping a nearby support strut as the ship executed a turn that would have been impossible for any human vessel, "I don't suppose you'd like to revise your story about pirates. Because those ships are broadcasting Korthak military codes, and the Korthak don't generally bother with petty theft. It's complicated. It always is. But here's the thing about complicated situations. They tend to get a lot simpler when people start shooting at you." Jake watched the tactical display as the pursuing ships closed distance with alarming speed. "Are we running or fighting? This ship isn't designed for combat." "No, but it's designed by people who understand that sometimes the universe gets cranky and starts throwing things at you. I've made some modifications to your power distribution system that might give us some options." Jake called up the engineering displays on his tablet, watching power flow through the hybrid systems he'd created. "Harmony, can you reroute auxiliary power to the deflector array?" The AI responded with what sounded like confused questioning. "Right, you don't have deflector arrays, you have." Jake studied the ship's defensive systems, trying to interpret musical notation into something resembling tactical options. "Harmonic resonance shields. Okay, we can work with that. Harmony, prepare to channel all available power to the harmonic shields, but route it through the human power couplings first." "What are you doing?" Lyra asked, her attention split between piloting and watching Jake's increasingly frantic manipulation of the ship systems. "I'm about to find out if human brute force engineering can make your elegant Etherian technology do something it was never designed to do." Jake finished his modifications and looked up as the first energy bolts from their pursuers lit up the space around them. "In other words, I'm going to see if we can make your shields loud enough to give those Korthak ships a really bad headache. That's not how harmonic shields work. It's not how they're supposed to work. But I've got a theory that if you run enough power through them at just the right frequency, they might start working like something else entirely." Jake grinned as proximity alarms began screaming and the ship shuddered under weapons fire. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? We could die." "Okay, what's the second worst thing that could happen?" Before Lyra could answer, Jake activated his modifications. The ship's harmonic hum suddenly shifted into something that sounded less like music and more like the universe clearing its throat very loudly. The harmonic pulse that erupted from Lyra's ship was like nothing Jake had ever experienced. It wasn't just sound. It was a physical force that rippled through spacetime itself, causing the pursuing Korthak vessels to shudder and veer off course as their targeting systems went haywire. One of them actually began spinning end over end, its pilot presumably wondering why his instruments were suddenly displaying poetry instead of tactical data. "Well," Jake said, watching the chaos on his tactical display, "that worked better than expected, though I think we just taught your ship to scream in colors. The harmonic resonance cascade is destabilizing their quantum targeting matrices," Lyra said, her voice carrying a mixture of amazement and something that might have been respect. "How did you know that would work?" "I didn't, but I figured if your people use music to communicate with computers, maybe we could use it to have a very loud argument with theirs." Jake watched as two more Korthak ships collided while trying to reorient their scrambled navigation systems. Plus, there's a universal principle that applies to both engineering and cosmic justice. Sometimes the best solution is to make more noise than the other guy. The remaining enemy ships were regrouping, their formations more cautious now but still determined. Jake was about to suggest another creative interpretation of Etherian technology when additional contacts appeared on the sensor display, sleek vessels that moved with the same fluid grace as Lyra's ship, but in numbers that made the Korthak force look like a minor inconvenience. "Let me guess," Jake said as the new arrivals began broadcasting in the musical language of Etherian communications. "More pirates." Lyra's posture had changed completely. The careful casualness she'd maintained was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like regal authority. "No," she said quietly, "those are my people. Your people have excellent timing and impressive firepower." Jake watched as the Etherian ships surrounded the confused Korthak vessels with movements that looked more like a carefully choreographed dance than a military maneuver. "I'm guessing they're here for you specifically." "Yes. And I'm also guessing that you're not just another traveler who happened to have really good taste in starships." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her hands still moving across the ship's controls with the unconscious expertise that Jake now realized came from a lifetime of training rather than simple familiarity. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions and responsibilities that Jake was only beginning to understand. "My name is Lyrale of the Etherian Dominion," she said, "and I am what you would call a queen." Jake blinked. Then he blinked again. Then he looked around the ship's interior, mentally cataloging all the advanced technology, the elegant design, and the fact that the AI had been unusually well-mannered even by Etherian standards. "So," he said finally, "when you said you were traveling incognito, you really meant it. I was returning from a diplomatic mission when the Korthak intercepted my ship. They've been trying to prevent the treaty negotiations between our peoples." "Right, okay. So, Your Majesty," Jake said, testing the words and finding them oddly comfortable, "does this mean I get to put Royal Engineer on my business cards? Because that would definitely help with my rates." Despite everything, the battle, the revelation, the fact that her cover had been completely blown, Lyrale laughed. It was the same silver bell sound Jake had heard when they first met, but now it carried overtones of relief and genuine affection. "You're taking this rather well," she observed. "Well, it explains a few things, like why your ship's AI is more polite than most humans and why those pirates were using military-grade quantum disruptors." Jake shrugged as the Etherian fleet finished surrounding the Korthak ships, their musical communications creating a harmony that even Jake's untrained ear could recognize as a demand for surrender. "Plus, I've always figured that interesting people come with interesting complications. I just hadn't realized how interesting." Through the ship's communication system came a voice speaking in musical Etherian, the tones formal and concerned. Lyrale responded in the same language, her words carrying authority that made Jake wonder how he'd ever mistaken her for an ordinary traveler. "My security chief is asking if you're holding me hostage," she translated with obvious amusement. "Tell him I'm just the repair guy, and if I were going to hold someone hostage, I'd pick someone who tips better." Jake watched as the Korthak ships finally powered down their weapons in surrender. "Though I have to ask, are you planning to have me mind-wiped or something? Because I've gotten kind of attached to my memories, even the embarrassing ones." "Why would I do that?" "Well, I know you're a queen now. That seems like classified information." Lyrale moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the genuine warmth in her eyes. "Jake Morrison, in the past 3 days you've repaired my ship with salvaged components and creative thinking, defended a stranger without asking questions, and just helped me escape an assassination attempt using engineering principles that shouldn't work but somehow do. Why would I want to erase the memory of meeting someone like that? When you put it that way, it does sound like I've been having an above-average week." The docking bay of the Etherian flagship was everything Jake had expected from a royal vessel. Elegant, sophisticated, and probably worth more than Haven's Rest's entire annual operating budget. What he hadn't expected was the way Lyrale's crew treated him with the same respect they showed their queen, as if saving her life had earned him a permanent place in their good graces. "So," Jake said as they walked through corridors that seemed to be carved from single pieces of crystal, "I have to ask, what happens now? Do I go back to fixing ships for travelers who may or may not be galactic royalty, or is there some kind of protocol for this situation?" "That depends," Lyrale said, pausing before a door that opened at her approach with a musical chime. "How would you feel about a job offer?" What kind of job offer? Chief Engineer for the Royal Fleet. It comes with an excellent benefits package, access to technology you've only dreamed of, and the opportunity to continue finding creative solutions to impossible problems. Jake considered this for a moment, weighing the appeal of advanced alien technology against the comfortable chaos of his workshop on Haven's Rest. And the dress code. Negotiable. Vacation time. Generous. Will I have to call you, Your Majesty, in formal situations? Only when my mother is visiting. Jake grinned. Tempting offer, Your Majesty, but I think I'll stick with Haven's Rest for now. Someone needs to keep the coffee makers running and the atmospheric processors from having nervous breakdowns. Besides, he added, pulling a small device from his toolkit, I made some modifications to your harmonic interface protocols. Your ship can